Hello and welcome to Hamilton's Happy Hour. Today we are starting a new series that we're calling True Baltimore Crime. Now some of these crimes may indeed have happened in Baltimore, in or around Baltimore. Some of the crimes may not have happened in or around Baltimore, but some of the involved parties have links to Baltimore. Before we get into today's episode, I want to remind everybody, of course, to check us out at hamiltonshappyhour.com. You can find links to all of our socials, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, everything. And if you're listening to this audio podcast, we're actually going to put a video podcast up on our YouTube page with pictures, maybe some crime scene pictures of people involved. So be sure to check out that as well on our YouTube site, which you can find through hamiltonshappyhour.com. Now, this is going to be a deep dive documentary type look at a murder murder attempt with ties to a famous Baltimore name. I was actually probably about 25, 30 years ago, I read a book called Flowers for Mrs. Luskin. And I picked the book up because if you've grown up in Baltimore or been around Baltimore, I guess 20, 30, 40 years ago, you know of Luskins. Luskins was an electronics chain based in Baltimore that was founded in 1948 and ceased operation in 1996. You couldn't have been in Baltimore in that time frame and not seen commercials for Luskins. They called themselves the cheapest guy in town. And this would have been before, Best Buy. I believe Circuit City may have been around. Radio Shack was still around. But Luskins was a local electronics chain. You saw their ads in the newspaper, commercials all over TV. Luskins actually began as a ice supply company founded by Jack Luskin and his brother Joe in 1948, growing into a chain of electronics stores that later reached a total of 60 in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia. The chain of Luskin stores would later be known as the cheapest guys in town, a phrase that would be used for many years in Luskin's advertisements. Another catchphrase the brothers adopted for their local advertising and promotion was, "Jack and Joe will save you dough." In 1985, Luskins went public, though by 1996, the stock was selling from 9 to 21 cents. In 1981, the Maryland Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division took Luskins to court over deceptive advertising prices on 3 occasions. A settlement would be reached, though Luskins was still in court for a separate incident at the time the closing was announced. Other controversies included a July 1992 promotion of certificates for free airfare and discounted hotel rates that the Attorney General's office claimed were deceptive. A later version that was slightly modified, removing the word free, was submitted for approval and began airing in September. When the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division protested, contending that in order to qualify, one would have to buy at least $200 worth of merchandise, followed by making hotel and other arrangements through a Florida-based firm named Vacation Ventures on December the 11th, 1992. Harford County Judge Cypriot O. Whitfield wrote in an opinion that Luskin's planned advertisements were neither deceptive nor unfair. So that's a quick rundown of Luskins, the electronics stores, some of the names involved. Like I said, what drew me to this story, the book Flowers for Mrs. Luskin, came out, 25, 30 years ago. I was still in my 20s. But imagine my shock when I'm reading this book that I picked up because, hey, this is a familiar name in Baltimore. It's a crime book. Let me check it out. Imagine my shock when I'm reading the book and see a familiar name in the book and come to find out that one of the people associated with this book, this story, Their children actually babysat me when I was a young kid. I'm not going to divulge any names, but it's pretty wild to read a book, come across a name that you're very familiar with, and realize one of these people involved in this story their child was my babysitter many times during my youth. So let's get right into the story. I hope you like it. I've taken a lot of information from newspaper articles that are over 30 years old. I've taken some clips from the book itself, and I actually have some clips from the indictment article itself from openjurist.org. So we got a lot of stuff to get into. Hope you like it. Again, check us out on hamiltonshappyhour.com. If you're digging this stuff, you can donate to the site donate to us through the site. You can also donate through our Cash App, $ The Happy Hour TV. Let's get into the story. A millionaire has an affair. His wife throws him out. She gets the mansion, the business, the cash. His parents' business, his parents' cash. She gets shot and doesn't know it. The bullet disappears. He goes to prison. His parents flee the country. He weds the other woman behind bars. Has there ever been a case like this? Flowers for Mrs. Luskin begins with a flower delivery to the best house in the best part of Hollywood, Florida. Inside, Marie Luskin was cautious. Her husband, Paul, used to send her flowers, but those days had ended more than a year before when she filed for divorce. She thought it was safe to open the door just enough to accept the pot of azaleas. She was wrong. The delivery was a ruse. We're now going to get into an article from the Baltimore Sun dated December 15th, 1991. On March 9th, 1987, a blue Honda Accord coasted to a halt in front of Paul and Marie Luskin's two-story, columned red brick mansion on a golf course in Emerald Hills, the most expensive house in this ritzy Hollywood, Florida neighborhood. The delivery man walked to the door of the $600,000 house, rang the doorbell, and spoke roughly into the intercom. "I got a flower delivery." "Who is it from?" asked Marie from behind a locked door. She had to be cautious. Her divorce had become one of Broward's ugliest. The file would eventually fill 8 boxes piled to the ceiling in its own corner of the Broward County Clerk's office, the most voluminous divorce file in the county's history. Legal bills alone would cost the Luskins an estimated $4 million. Marie had had her 37-year-old ex-husband jailed twice in the previous 3 months for failure to pay temporary alimony. She knew of no reason why someone would send her flowers. Emerald Hills florist for Marie Luskin. Marie thought it over for a few seconds. Curiosity got the better of her. "Okay, wait a minute." She opened the door. In walked a man holding a flower pot of pink azaleas. Suddenly, he pulled a nickel-plated .38 revolver from behind the flowers. He stuck the gun barrel in her face. She started screaming. "Shut up," barked Milton Sonny Cohen, a self-described stick-up man and bank robber from Baltimore with a criminal record dating back to 1954. He was a head taller than Marie and wore a t-shirt and slacks, with greasy brown hair hanging down his neck. He had the meanest eyes she had ever seen. He placed his hand over Marie's throat, then her mouth. "Give me all your cash," Cohen yelled. Marie told him it was upstairs. Holding Marie from behind by her long blonde hair and pressing the gun to her temple, he bypassed the elevator and forced her up the grand stairway to the 1,700 square foot master bedroom. In the dressing room, in front of the custom vanity, Marie knelt down, pulled out a small metal box, and opened it. Inside was a single $100 bill, her passport, some earrings, and inexpensive collector coins. There was also a drawstring pouch in which she said there was a diamond necklace worth $50,000. Cohen didn't open it. He yelled at her again, "Where is your effing money? I'll blow your effing brains out if you don't give it to me." Marie screamed back, "It's in the bank! It's in the bank!" What happened next is unclear. Cohen says he popped her on the head from behind with a blackjack. Marie thought he hit her with the gun butt. In any case, she wound up lying on the carpet, feigning unconsciousness, blood seeping from her wound. Cohen ran downstairs, scooped up the pieces of the flower pot that carried his fingerprints, and fled. He left behind the drawstring pouch and the $100 bill. The Hollywood police saw the assault on Marie Luskin as a botched robbery attempt, a simple home invasion. But they couldn't figure out why the invader took nothing. Marie saw something more sinister. She told them that her estranged husband and possibly his father may have been behind the attack because of their messy divorce. The police interviewed Paul Luskin, CEO of the 13-store Luskins chain, unrelated to the chain his Baltimore cousins run, and his parents. They found them solicitous, concerned, willing to help. There was no reason to trouble them further. 7 months later, a federal grand jury in Baltimore made headlines by disagreeing. The botched robbery was actually a botched murder for hire solicited by Paul Luskin. A federal informant, one of the alleged hitmen, had given the grand jurors a very different version of what happened when Marie let the florist in. There was no gun butt that struck Marie, the informant said. It was no blackjack. It was a bullet. The informant, Baltimore City jail prisoner James Manley, said Marie had been shot. She just didn't realize it. In the space of 6 months, Paul Luskin was indicted, tried, convicted of conspiracy to murder his estranged wife, and sentenced to 35 years in prison. The twin motives, money and revenge. Luskin, the prosecution said, was desperate to stop his wife from using the divorce to grab control of the family fortune. To this day, Paul Luskin, father of 2, former millionaire, big-time fundraiser for Republican candidates, and current federal prisoner, insists the murder-for-hire scheme never existed. He was, he claims, victimized by a vengeful wife, a wily con angling for a shorter sentence, and hungry prosecutors looking for a big fish to fry. This spring, Luskin thought he saw a way to prove his innocence. One of the alleged hitmen who, as a co-defendant of Luskin's, had declined to testify at the trial, gave a statement to Luskin's appellate attorney. There was no murder for hire, he said. He and his partners had concocted the whole story in jail so they would be able to trade Luskin to prosecutors for reduced prison time. Luskin's lawyer moved for a new trial, but 3 months ago, U.S. District Court Judge J. Frederick Motz bluntly rejected Luskin's plea. The word of a convicted felon was not enough to overturn the conviction. Of course, it was exactly that, the word of a career criminal that had gotten Luskin convicted in the first place. "I feel as low right now as I can get," Luskin said after he heard Judge Motz's decision at the Federal Correctional Institution in Jessup, Georgia. This might be Jessup, Maryland, but the article says Jessup, Georgia, so we'll go with that. "I don't know if I'll ever get out of here alive." Making music. But for an alert security guard on an Amtrak train northbound through the Carolinas, Paul Luskin might have never had to worry about federal prison. In July 1987, 4 months after the assault on Marie, security agent Calvin Burns spotted 2 suspicious passengers. James Manley and Sonny Cohen had boarded the Silver Meteor in Fort Lauderdale en route to Baltimore, a 24-hour trip. Mr. Burns learned that each man had bought a round-trip ticket for $449 cash. They had adjoining roomettes. They were returning to Baltimore after only one day in Florida. All this fit the typical drug courier profile. Mr. Burns phoned ahead. When the train stopped in Baltimore's Penn Station, another Amtrak undercover cop pointed out the suspects. Cohen was carrying a black travel bag, Manley a black guitar case. The cops pounced. Two police dogs excitedly sniffed the luggage. Inside Cohen's bag, cops found more than 3 ounces of cocaine and 13 plastic packets, $3,761 in cash, a .25 caliber Beretta pistol, a 6-inch silencer, and a .22 caliber Sturm Ruger pistol. Inside Manley's guitar case was a .223 caliber AR-15 A2 Colt rifle with a laser and scope. The weapons were loaded. Manley and Cohen were jailed on drugs and weapon charges. The contents of the guitar case may not have been able to make music, but Manley, a graying 44-year-old ex-con, knew how to sing. A month later, in exchange for a lighter sentence, he offered to testify in what he said would be a much bigger case. Federal officials took him up on it. Manley told them that Cohen was under contract to murder Marie Luskin, and that after blowing the first attempt, Cohen had hired Manley to help him finish the job. The contractor, Paul Luskin. A star is born. The feds listened, fascinated, as Manley sketched the complicated chain of connections from South Florida to Baltimore and back that tied him to Luskin. He and Cohen were in-laws. They had met in reform school. Manley said Cohen told him he had been commissioned to kill Marie by Jimmy Liberto, who owned Pellugi's restaurant in Little Italy. Liberto's brother Joe, who lived in Coral Springs, Florida, had worked 20 years for Luskin's Hi-Fi and had been a senior executive for Paul Luskin and a family friend. Manley said Cohen told him that Paul Luskin wanted to kill his wife because he risked losing his business in the divorce. Manley told the feds that the total price for the hit was $50,000, that once Marie was dead, the Libertos would have split $20,000, and he and Cohen would have gotten the remaining $30,000. But the money was never paid because the hit never came off. Prosecutors made Manley a deal. Testify, and we'll let you plead guilty to a lesser charge, possession of a silencer. Instead of a maximum 90-year sentence on federal drugs and weapon charges, which might have meant roughly 20 years actual prison time, Manley would plead to a charge that could bring him a sentence of 10 years. The judge gave him 7, with an expected release date of 52 months. Manley knew a bargain when he saw one. In January 1988, when Luskin appeared in court alongside the Libertos and Cohen, the prosecution's star witness spewed forth details, specifics, dates, and names. But he admitted that he had never personally dealt with Luskin or even the Libertos. Everything he knew, he got from his old pal Cohen, who took his orders from the Libertos. Manley said Cohen told him all about playing the florist and bungling the hit. He gotten all the way to Baltimore thinking Marie Luskin was dead, right up to the point when he asked Jimmy Liberto for his pay. Jimmy laughed at him and said, "She ain't dead. She's got 18 stitches in her head," Manley testified. When Liberto told Cohen to try again, Manley said Cohen contacted him. Now that Marie had seen Cohen, he needed someone to help. He gave Manley a $2,500 cash advance. That was in May 1987. Manley said that he and Cohen drove down to Florida to kill Marie Luskin. To hear Manley tell it, the second attempt was even lamer than the first. Manley went to a mall and bought black pants, black shoes, and a black shirt, a toy whistle, and a toy silver badge with an eagle on it so he could pose as a security officer. Manley's uniform was nothing like the Emerald Hill security patrols, but this didn't stop him. He slipped into the neighborhood alone one night and sat under a tree behind Marie's house with a handgun, drinking 1-quart bottle and 6 12-ounce cans of beer, waiting for Marie to come home. She didn't. End of murder attempt. The two men returned to Baltimore the next day. Manley said they were back 2 months later in late July for a third try. He said Cohen told him there will be a $25,000 bonus if they murdered Marie by July 30th. I knew that the divorce was getting very imminent and the woman had to be killed, Manley said. But once again, the hit attempt described by Manley was less than professional. Marie was to attend a dinner at Bennigan's restaurant near her house. Manley said they had been fed that information by her husband through the Libertos. Manley and Cohen rode Amtrak to Fort Lauderdale, rented a Dodge Aries on Jimmy Liberto's borrowed credit card account, then went to the restaurant parking lot to wait for Marie. This time, their firepower was more impressive, an AR-15 rifle with a scope and laser. Marie arrived on schedule at 7 p.m., but she was surrounded by people from the moment she got out of her car until she entered the restaurant. Manley couldn't get a clear shot. When she left, he had the same problem. The two would-be assassins followed Marie's green Mercedes in their rental car as she left the parking lot, hoping to shoot her as she sat at the wheel of her car. But when they realized the Mercedes had dark tinted windows, Manley testified, he turned to Cohen, who was driving, and said, "That's it. We might as well go out and get drunk." The next morning, the pair departed by train and were arrested on the drugs and weapon charges 24 hours later in Baltimore. Prosecutors made Manley a deal. We'll let you plead guilty to a lesser charge, possession of a silencer. As we scooch forward into the story, guys, again, want to remind you that this will also be posted on our YouTube page with many pictures, both of the involved parties, some old Luskins ads, and some clips from the Flowers for Mrs. Luskin's book. Again, you can find our YouTube page through our website, hamiltonshappyhour.com. Now back to the story. Money can't buy you love. When federal officials started looking at Paul Luskin after hearing Manley's story, the motive for murder that had been suggested by Marie, a messy divorce, took on a new dimension. The divorce was too messy, what Freddy Krueger is to a neighborhood bully. Marie and Paul met at the University of Miami in 1969 when both were undergraduates there. Paul had grown up in a prominent Baltimore family. His uncle and his father had made millions selling discount electronics under the slogan, "Jack and Joe will save you dough." But the brothers had a falling out, and Joe started over in North Miami Beach in 1968. Paul, then 20, and a student at the University of Maryland, gladly transferred to Miami. He says of his attraction to Marie, "She was pretty, she was smart, and she was independent, and she wasn't from Baltimore. Actually, she was from Wilmington, Delaware, but that was exotic enough for Paul." When things got serious, Paul returned to Baltimore to talk to his high school sweetheart, a pretty blonde named Susan Pruce. Should he marry Marie? Susan was not an objective observer. At 14, she said, "I knew who I wanted to marry. He looked like a nerd, but I didn't think so at the time. He was neat, had a great sense of fun, and made everything seem special." At 20, she still carried a torch for him. She had no problem giving him advice on the subject of Marie. "Don't marry her," she said. "If you have to ask me, you shouldn't do it." He did anyway. They were married in Miami Beach in June of 1971. Paul returned to Baltimore to finish law school at the University of Baltimore. Then in 1975 moved back to South Florida, where he went to work in the family retail business. Within 10 years, he expanded the chain from 2 outlets to 13, making it a high-profile mainstay of South Florida's booming electronics market. Luskins Hi-Fi peaked at a $37 million gross in 1985. At first, Paul and Marie lived modestly in a $50,000 house in North Miami Beach with a Chevy in the driveway. Later, they bought a $143,000 house not far away, but in 1983, Paul and Marie picked out a $600,000 showcase, the biggest house in Emerald Hills. It had 9 bedrooms for a family with 2 kids, an elevator, a walk-in safe concealed behind a bookcase, a grand staircase like the one on the TV show Dallas, and a mirrored dressing room in the master suite. The backyard was on the Emerald Hills Country Club golf course. Paul said he was making $200,000 a year plus perks. He was doing well, even better if you counted his parents' generosity. At the house closing, Joe and Mildred Luskin wrote Paul and Marie a check for $300,000. The next year, Joe and Mildred split ownership of the business into thirds and gave Paul 1/3 as a reward for running it. Paul and Marie kept up the house, had a small boat, and bought a summer home and $200,000 worth of jewelry, including a 7-carat diamond. But, as they say, the money didn't buy happiness. Friends say the marriage had been rocky for a long time. Then, in July 1985, Paul's old high school sweetheart, Susan Davis, and her husband, Gary, moved into a home a mile away from Emerald Hills. In October 1985, Gary and Marie discovered that Paul and Susan were having an affair. Both marriages exploded. 6 weeks later, Marie's lawyer walked into Paul's office with the divorce papers. Marie wanted their 2 daughters and virtually all of the marital assets, including the multi-million-dollar 1/3 interest that Paul's parents had given him in the chain, plus all of Paul's commercial real estate, all his cash, the summer home in North Carolina, a new Mercedes, and $8,000 a month in temporary alimony and child support. After the lawyers left, Luskin drove home. No one was there but the live-in maid, Marie's maid, Luskin called her. He fired her. In a rage, he grabbed a pair of scissors from Marie's dressing table and slashed 4 oil paintings he had given her as their last anniversary present. Then he slashed 2 posters in the bedroom. Then he left his own art, 2 identical messages scrawled on the walls of the foyer in bright red magic marker. Kids, I'll never leave you. Dad. The Luskin divorce would take 2 years to come to trial. The biggest fight was over Paul's interest in the business. To Marie's surprise, Paul said he didn't have it anymore, that he had given it back to his parents 8 months before Marie filed for divorce. Paul said his parents blamed him for declining sales and demanded he relinquish his interest. That was the agreement all along, he said, that he would retain a share of the business only as long as profits continued. Marie's lawyers thought that explanation was a little too convenient, especially since neither Paul nor his parents could produce any written documents to that effect. Add to that the judge's finding that Paul and his parents had illegally created a backdated promissory note for the $300,000 the parents had given Paul and Marie to buy their house, and you have the background for an astoundingly one-sided final judgment. In February 1988, in the midst of Paul's criminal trial, now deceased Broward County Judge Constance Notaro ordered Paul to pay Marie $2.5 million, which the judge said was the value of Paul's 1/3 of the business in 1985, and $6,000 a month in permanent alimony and child support. Marie also got the house, the vacation home in North Carolina, and $1 million in South Florida commercial property the company owned. Nutaro allowed Paul his personal jewelry and the $500,000 in cash he claimed never existed. I never promised you a rose garden. Assistant U.S. Attorney Maury Epner scoffed at the contention that there was a secret deal. I haven't researched the file, but I'm sure there's a very simple answer that completely blows his theory sky high, he said. By filing these motions, they're wasting my time and the court's time. They're like insects. They're real pains, and we can't seem to get rid of them. How many times will these guys keep filing motions? Joseph and Mildred Luskin disappeared in 1988 after they closed the business. They are fugitives and have never paid a penny of the $10.9 million judgment against them, though more than $1 million of their property had been seized and sold at auction. Barry Franklin, Marie's divorce attorney, says he believes that they still control about $7.5 million in assets. Paul said he suspects his parents are broke. They are living outside the United States. He won't be more specific. Marie has so far collected at least $2 million from the seized property and from suits against title companies that had permitted the sale of some of the Luskins' assets despite the court-ordered freeze. She also sold the house mortgage-free for $875,000. She lives in Hollywood. Paul has not seen his two daughters, now 14 and 9, since he was convicted in March of 1988. He says he gets rare letters. The most recent letter came from his elder daughter after a Miami Herald story in June of this year reported Cohen's claim that Paul had had nothing to do with the attack on Marie. If this is true, Dad, he says his daughter wrote him, then I want you to come home. Susan, Paul's high school sweetheart, lives in Hollywood and works for an insurance agency in North Miami Beach. Once a month, she drives her Mercury Sable to the Federal Correctional Institution in Jessup, Georgia, about 100 miles north of Jacksonville, to see Paul. They play Scrabble and they talk about his fight for freedom. They are allowed a kiss when they meet and a kiss a few hours later when she leaves. Susan said there are times when she gets depressed, other times when she can joke about the situation. She says if they ever make the movie, she wants to be played by Kathleen Turner. In October 1989, Paul and Susan were married in a traditional Jewish ceremony at the federal prison in Marianna, Florida. She was 38, he was 41. She wore a V-neck ivory lace dress, pretty enough to be a wedding dress, conservative enough for the guards to let me in, and high heels. Paul's white outfit was specially tailored and monogrammed by the staff of the prison's food service where he worked. He wore white yarmulke and new white leather Reeboks, a gift from Susan. He looked real nice, she says. The wedding was held outdoors. A rabbi drove over from Dothan, Alabama. He brought kosher grape juice. No wine is allowed in prison, with which they drank from a silver goblet. Susan's parents blessed the wedding. My parents would have not let me marry someone who had tried to kill his former wife, she says. On the evening they were married, Paul had a florist take roses to Susan's hotel room. Flowers for Mrs. Luskins. We're now going to jump to another article from the Baltimore Sun. This one dated June 10th, 1991. New trial is considered in murder plot. U.S. District Court Judge J. Frederick Motz is considering a motion for a new trial for Paul Luskin, a Miami man convicted in Baltimore in 1988 in a murder-for-hire plot against his ex-wife. Luskin, serving a 35-year sentence in the federal prison in Jessup, Georgia, had asked Motz for a new trial based on a recent confession by Milton Sonny Cohen Jr. that defense lawyers say absolves Luskin of complicity in the plot. Cohen, a Middle River man who was convicted as the hitman in the case, is serving a 50-year sentence at the federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. In a 104-page affidavit, Cohen describes how he and James Manley made up a story about Luskin being involved in a murder-for-hire plot against his former wife Marie. Cohen states that he made up the story as a favor to James Liberto, the former owner of the now-defunct Pellugi's restaurant in Little Italy. He says Liberto's brother Joe was passed over for a promotion by Luskin to serve as a general manager for Luskin's Hi-Fi, a South Florida retail chain that Paul Luskin's family owns. Paul Luskin is a nephew of Baltimore appliance retailer Jack Luskin, but the businesses are not connected. James and Joe Liberto were also convicted in the murder-for-hire plot and are currently serving sentences in federal prisons. Cohen said that he cased the plush Luskin Manor near Fort Lauderdale and robbed Marie Luskin after posing as a flower delivery man. Cohen said that during the robbery, he struck Mrs. Luskin on the back of the head with a blunt instrument called a blackjack, contrary to testimony in the 6-week trial in the winter of 1988 that stated Mrs. Luskin could have been shot at close range. The wound was superficial, and Miss Luskin testified against her former husband and Cohen during the trial. I'm now going to jump to some of the documents from the actual court case. United States of America versus Paul Luskin versus Milton Bachman Cohen, a.k.a. Sonny Cohen, versus James J. Liberto and versus Joseph Liberto. This are the case documents argued March 8th, 1989, decided September 19th, 1989. In this case, a routine drug courier profile stopped by the Baltimore City Police led to the discovery of a murder-for-hire scheme involving each of the named appellants, Paul Luskins, James Liberto, Joseph Liberto, and Sonny Cohen, all of whom were convicted by a jury of conspiracy to commit murder and various related weapon charges. These convictions stemmed from a plot to kill Luskin's wife. Prior to trial, each of the appellants filed motions for severance, asserting the potential for prejudice from antagonistic defenses. Luskin, in particular, sought severance on the basis that evidence admissible only against the other defendants might be improperly used against him. Cohen also filed a motion to suppress evidence seized at the time of his arrest. The district court denied all motions for severance as well as the motion to suppress. After a 4-week trial, the jury returned verdicts of guilty on all counts against each appellate. Lengthy jail sentences were imposed, and a timely appeal was noted by each appellate. As we find no error on record to support a reversal of those convictions, we affirm. On July 30, 1987, Sonny Cohen and James Manley were arrested at the train station in Baltimore, Maryland. Authorities in Baltimore had been alerted by Amtrak security officials in Florida that the two men fit the drug courier profile. Specifically, Baltimore officials were advised that Cohen and Manley had purchased round-trip first-class tickets with cash, stayed in Florida less than 1 day prior to returning to Baltimore on a 24-hour train ride, and that Cohen had left a callback number for his train reservation to an inoperative number. Upon exiting the train, the two men were stopped by Baltimore City Detective McVicker and Amtrak security guards and asked to produce identification. Manley was unable to do so and appeared visibly nervous. In fact, Detective McVicker testified that Manley was shaken and seemed to be petrified. Suspicions aroused, Officer McVicker and the Amtrak security guards escorted the two men to an interview room to subject their luggage to a dog sniff. The dogs reacted positively. The officers then obtained a search warrant, searched the luggage, and found a loaded AR-15 with a laser scope in Manley's luggage. In the bag carried by Cohen, 2 loaded pistols, a silencer, and 3.5 ounces of cocaine were found. Both men were arrested. Manley entered into a post-arrest plea agreement with the government, and upon his testimony, the following facts were extracted. Paul Luskin was involved in a long and bitter divorce proceeding with his wife Marie. At stake was the bulk of Luskin's assets, including a successful Florida business. Rather than proceed with the divorce and risk losing such assets, Luskin resolved to have his wife killed. To such an end, Luskin contacted longtime associate Joe Liberto and advised him of his plan. Joe then contacted his brother Jimmy, also a business associate of Luskin, who in turn commissioned Sonny Cohen to kill Marie Luskin in Florida. Such services were to cost Paul Luskin $50,000. Cohen traveled to Florida to carry out the plan. On March 9, 1987, posing as a floral delivery man, Cohen gained entry to Marie Luskin's home and shot her in the head. She survived the wound. Fearing that during his failed attempt to kill her, Marie Luskin saw his face, Cohen recruited Manley to aid him in completing the murder contract. In May of 1987, the two men traveled to Florida together, devised an elaborate scheme to finish her job, but ultimately failed. Prior to the third attempt to kill Mrs. Luskin, Cohen told Manley that there would be a $25,000 bonus if the job were completed on July 28th. Apparently, divorce proceedings between the Luskins were soon to begin, and Paul Luskin wished to have the matter attended to prior to that time. However, this final attempt on Marie Luskin's life also resulted in failure, and upon return to Baltimore, the two were arrested. Manley's testimony was corroborated by the government's proffer of various telephone bills, hotel registration forms, and credit card receipts. At trial, all appellants denied participation in this murder-for-hire scheme. Luskin asserted that Cohen and the Liberto brothers were involved in a large-scale drug distribution operation in which he had no part. Jimmy Liberto asserted that evidence offered by the government against him that he often traveled to Florida and owned the gun found in Manley's luggage showed little more than legitimate business travel and a desire for self-protection. Joe Liberto asserted that any evidence against him showed only legal activity. Finally, Sonny Cohen asserted that because no one could positively identify him as Marie Luskin's assailant on March 9th, there was insufficient evidence to support his conviction. All right, so there's a little bit more of the background, the actual court documents from the case. Before we get into, I guess, what would be the final chapter of the story, we again want to remind you to check us out on our website, hamiltonshappyhour.com. We are putting this podcast also in video form on our YouTube page. And on the YouTube video, you can see some of the documents, some pictures of the crime scene, pictures of the people involved. So if you want a little video to go along with the audio, check out our YouTube page, which you can find at hamiltonshappyhour.com. Now let's get into the final chapter of the Luskin saga. And we're going to read from a Baltimore Sun article dated October 19th, 2000. And the title of the article is A New Chapter in Luskin Saga. U.S. District Judge J. Frederick Motz will write today what could be the final chapter in the saga of Paul B. Luskin, the Baltimore native convicted in 1988 of plotting to have his wife killed to end a multi-million-dollar divorce fight. After nearly 13 years in prison, Luskin had asked Motz to reduce his 35-year sentence, possibly to time served. The judge has indicated that he will trim the sentence, but left hanging until a court hearing this morning is the question of by how much. The resentencing will be one more twist in a case that has stretched on for years and appeals and inspired a book with its stranger-than-fiction plot featuring an ugly divorce in South Florida and 3 botched murder attempts, including one in which the hitman posed as a flower delivery man. The attempts to kill Marie Luskin, now Marie Wrights, were unsuccessful. She testified against her former husband at his trial in 1988 and said in an October 6 letter to court officials that he shouldn't be freed until he accepts responsibility for the crime. Shouldn't he admit his guilt, accept his due punishment, and make amends for his cruel crime? Wrights wrote, Paul Luskin needs to stop lying to all of us and get to work on his deep-seated anger. Federal parole officials, who prosecutors say should decide on Luskin's release, also raised the issue of his accepting responsibility when they denied his request for parole in October 1998. Luskin has maintained his innocence, refusing to apologize even when it could have earned him a break. If it were true, the easiest thing for him to say would be that, because it gets him where he wants to be, said his defense attorney Herbert Better of Baltimore. Before he was accused, convicted, and imprisoned in the murder-for-hire plot, Luskin was a successful businessman and a major political player. He operated an appliance store in South Florida, unconnected to the Baltimore appliance stores run by his uncle Jack Luskin. He was asked in 1987 to chair a presidential exploratory committee for Colorado Representative Patricia Schrader and dined with U.S. Senator Paula Hawkins at her Florida home just weeks before his indictment, according to a 1988 letter to Mott's. Luskin was also in the midst of a bitter divorce, spurred in part by his affair with former girlfriend, who he later married while in prison. Just before his criminal trial, a judge presiding over the divorce case ordered Luskin to pay his former wife, $2.5 million as well as $6,000 a month in alimony and child support for their two daughters. At the end of their 17-year marriage, she also got control of their home in Hollywood, Florida, a vacation home in North Carolina, and about $1 million in commercial property. Federal investigators argue that the high-stakes divorce proceedings were the motive behind the murder-for-hire scheme that unfolded in 1987. Court records and trial testimony indicate that Luskin offered a business associate $50,000 to arrange his wife's killing. The first attempt was March 9, 1987, when a hired hitman, Milton Sonny Cohen of Baltimore, posed as a flower delivery man outside the Luskins' home in Florida. When Marie Luskin opened the door, Cohen demanded money and then struck her on the back of the head, knocking her to the ground, where she pretended to be unconscious. Cohen, who was convicted for his role in the crime, said in court records that he used a blackjack to strike her. Prosecutors argued that she was hit by a bullet, although the wound was superficial. Investigators never found a bullet or bullet hole in the home. Cohen went back to Florida twice more in the next 4 months, with James Manley of Baltimore trying to finish the plan. For the third attempt, according to court records, Luskins offered a $25,000 bonus. The two men failed both times to even come into contact with Marie Luskin. As Manley and Cohen returned to Baltimore on an Amtrak train after their last try, they were arrested on gun charges for carrying a loaded AR-15 rifle, 2 loaded pistols, and a silencer. In a court filing this month, federal prosecutors noted, fortunately, persons who seek to retain the services of hitmen rarely succeed in hiring the sort of trained, experienced, and meticulous assassins we are accustomed to seeing on television. Manley, later convicted of a lesser charge, led authorities to Luskin. Federal investigators in Baltimore pursued the case on the grounds that the scheme was devised in Maryland, even though it was to be carried out in Florida. Within 6 months, Luskin, then 40, was indicted, convicted, and sentenced. Mott's, who presided over the original trial, sentenced Luskin to 35 years in federal prison with no chance of parole for 15 years. The other defendants in the case, chronicled in the 1997 book Flowers for Mrs. Luskin by Arthur J. Harris, received sentences ranging from 22 years to 33 years. Luskin was charged before Congress passed federal sentencing guidelines giving judges strict limits for setting punishment and specifying when parole is not included. That meant Motz had more leeway in sentencing Luskin than he would have if the case were tried today. Prosecutors argue that under current guidelines, Luskins would have to serve at least 19 years without a chance at parole. Luskin's defense attorneys say guidelines adopted after he was charged shouldn't be considered. They asked Motz in December to reduce the sentence, arguing that a change in parole rules for contract murder gave Luskin little chance for an early release. At a hearing this week, they argued that Luskin had been punished enough. There is no question that Mr. Luskin stands convicted of a very serious crime. The only question is whether Mr. Luskin had been punished enough, Better said in court Monday. Luskin first came up for parole in 1988, and Motz recommended his release at that time if the federal parole board agreed. Under his current sentence, Luskin would next be eligible for parole in 2003. With credit for good behavior, he would automatically be released from prison in 2008. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rod J. Rosenstein said the decision on when Luskin leaves prison should be left to the parole board. Motz seemed to agree at times in Monday's hearing, telling defense attorneys, "Why should I substitute my wisdom for theirs?" Luskin, who appeared in court wearing a white t-shirt, his curly hair graying, spoke briefly. "I do want to thank the court for all the effort and consideration you have given my case over the years," he said. Motz said that if he had reduced Luskin's sentence, it would be in spite of, not because of, the numerous appeals his attorneys have filed over the past decade. But Motz also said that it appeared Luskin's prison term would extend beyond what the judge originally intended with parole, and that he was inclined to reduce the sentence. "I do think the sentence was too high, and I'm going to reduce the sentence," Motz said Monday. "But the question is, how much?" Now we're going to jump to an article dated October 20, 2000, also from the Baltimore Sun. This article titled, "Paul Luskin Admits Guilt." After maintaining his innocence for 13 years, Baltimore native Paul B. Luskin admitted yesterday to the federal judge considering reducing his prison term that he helped plan the murder-for-hire plot against his former wife. U.S. District Judge J. Frederick Motz responded to Luskin's dramatic courtroom confession by cutting almost 10 years off his 35-year sentence. That change, opposed by federal prosecutors, will make Luskin immediately eligible for parole, which Motz urged prison authorities to approve. "Heaven knows I'm not a priest, and I've never heard a confession of the soul," Motz said in issuing Luskin's revised sentence. "But I came as close to hearing a confession of the soul today as I'd ever come." Luskin's unexpected admission punctuated the bizarre contract killing case that grew out of a multi-million-dollar divorce fight in South Florida and involved 3 botched murder attempts, including one in which the hitman posed as a flower delivery man. After the failed attempts to kill Marie Luskin, now Marie writes, she testified against her ex-husband at his 1988 trial in federal court in Baltimore, where prosecutors say the scheme was hatched. She recently asked court officials not to release him until he accepted responsibility for the crime. In court yesterday, Luskin, 52, said that after 13 years of burying aspects of this case as far down as I can, he owed Wrights and their 2 daughters an explanation and an apology. "I don't know how to address this court in a manner that would show how deeply, deeply sorry I am for participating in this horrible crime," Luskin said. "At the same time, I wish to apologize to my ex-wife through this court for my actions and to let her know that she is in no danger, and I do wish her well." Speaking of his children, with whom he has had little contact in years, Luskin said, "Through my actions today, they'll know that I did accept responsibility, and I am truly sorry for ruining their lives and putting their mother in jeopardy." Luskin, once a political player and millionaire businessman with a chain of appliance stores in South Florida, spoke to Montz in slow, halting sentences. He wore a maroon prison jumpsuit and stood with his hands folded in front of him as he spoke. His admission came at the start of a court hearing in which Montz was expected to reduce Luskin's sentence based on defense arguments that changes in parole rules meant Luskins could end up in prison far longer than Montz had originally intended. Montz, however, had not indicated by how much he would trim the sentence, and at the end of yesterday's hearing, he hinted that he would not have been as lenient if Luskin had not admitted culpability. The confession was a stark turnaround for Luskin, who has steadfastly maintained his innocence for more than a decade. In a 1988 letter to Montz, who presided over his original trial, Luskin requested a new trial, saying it made no sense that he would try to kill his wife in the midst of their divorce proceedings. Luskins offered few details yesterday about the crime. He said only that the scheme started with a conversation he had had with one of his store managers. 3 other men were convicted in the plot. 2 of those men are still in prison. Daniel Liberto, the son of James Liberto of Baltimore, who was serving his 33-year sentence, was in court yesterday to hear the ruling on Luskin. "If he's getting something overturned, then something should be overturned for my dad," Liberto said. Montz, who had called yesterday's event as dramatic as one can see in a courtroom, acknowledged some might argue that Luskin had changed his story to get a break in his sentence. But the judge said he perceived Luskin's admission as honest and heartfelt. "I truly believe that today was a day on which this system worked," Montz said. If his sentence had not been changed, Luskin would not have been eligible for parole until 2003, and he would not have been automatically released from prison until 2008. Under the new sentence, he would be automatically released by 2003 if he is not paroled. Federal prosecutors had opposed reducing Luskin's sentence. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rod J. Rosenstein said the confession would have been appropriate for the Federal Parole Board to consider, but should not have automatically earned Luskin a shorter prison term. Defense attorney Herbert Better of Baltimore said the new developments should give Luskin a good chance to leave prison soon. "He wanted to bring closure and move on," Better said. "I think he was relieved, unburdened, and relieved." So that's it for the True Baltimore Crime episode, taking a look at flowers for Mrs. Luskins. I hope you enjoyed it. This was a little more detailed than a usual podcast, so these won't be happening as frequently as normal podcasts. They take more time to research, they take more time to record, edit, and get online. But we do have a few more subjects in mind for future episodes. If you have an idea for a subject for a future episode, please feel free to email us, hamiltonshappyhour@gmail.com. You can find all of our contact info on our website, hamiltonshappyhour.com, and you can also find links to all of our socials, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, if by chance you want to watch this podcast and see some pictures of the people that were involved, crime scene photos and such. So again, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning in to this hour-long episode of Hamilton's Happy Hour. And until next time, guys, take care and see ya.